The morning of December 21st, 1944, broke cold and white across the snow-covered heights of Elsenborn Ridge in eastern Belgium. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed himself deeper into the frozen earth, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. Around him, what remained of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division huddled in hastily dug positions, their grey-green uniforms stark against the endless white. 3 days ago, they had been part of Adolf Hitler's grand offensive through the Ardennes. Now they were pinned down, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and above all else, unable to understand what was killing them. Another sound split the frozen morning. Not the shriek of a Nebelwerfer rocket, not the crack of a Panzerfaust, but something different. Something that had haunted Hartmann for days now. A distant rumble, then a rushing sound through the air, then the earth-shattering explosion of 100-pound high-explosive shells landing with terrifying precision among German positions. The American artillery. Always the American artillery. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hartmann had been an artilleryman himself before being transferred to the infantry after his gun crew was killed near Cayenne. He knew the sound of artillery fire the way a musician knows music. He knew the rhythms, the patterns, the telltale signs of caliber and range. And what he was hearing from the American positions made no sense. The shells were landing from positions his own artillery couldn't possibly reach. When German guns tried to fire counter-battery, their shells fell short by kilometers. The Americans could hit the Germans, but the Germans couldn't hit back. This was not how it was supposed to be. Klaus Hartmann had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939 with absolute certainty in German technical superiority. The propaganda had been clear and consistent. German engineering was the finest in the world. German weapons were the most advanced. German industry produced the best artillery, the fastest tanks, the most powerful aircraft. The early victories had seemed to confirm everything. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The British retreated across the Channel. German arms were invincible, and German guns ruled every battlefield. By 1942, Hartmann had been assigned to an artillery battalion equipped with the 15-centimeter Schwer Feldhaubitze 18, the SFH-18, nicknamed Immergrün, or Evergreen, by the crews who served it. It was the standard heavy howitzer of the Wehrmacht, the backbone of divisional artillery. The weapon was impressive to look at. It weighed over 6,000 kilograms. Its barrel alone measured nearly 15 feet in length. When it fired, the ground shook. The 96-pound high-explosive shells it hurled toward the enemy seemed devastating. The SFH-18 had been introduced into service in May of 1935, the product of a design competition between Germany's 2 premier artillery manufacturers, Krupp and Rheinmetall. The weapon combined Rheinmetall's barrel with Krupp's carriage, creating what German gunners believed was the finest howitzer in the world. It could traverse 60 degrees without moving the gun itself, far more than earlier models. It could fire 4 rounds per minute when the crew was working efficiently. More than 1,300 of them had been in service when the war began, and production had continued throughout the conflict. Hartmann had been proud to serve such a weapon. The training had been rigorous and thorough. German artillery doctrine emphasized precision, coordination, and the aggressive use of fire to support rapid advances. The crews learned to set up and tear down their positions with mechanical efficiency. They learned the mathematics of indirect fire, the careful calculations of elevation and deflection that would send shells arcing toward targets they couldn't see. They learned to work as a single organism, each man performing his role without hesitation. The propaganda reinforced everything they learned. The newsreels showed German guns pounding enemy positions. The radio announced victory after victory. The officers assured them that German artillery was superior to anything the Allies possessed. The French guns were obsolete relics. The British guns were too few and poorly supplied. The Americans, when they finally entered the war, would bring quantity, but never quality. Numbers could not overcome German technical excellence. The practical range of the SFH-18 was just over 13,000 meters, roughly 8 miles. The official maximum was listed as slightly higher, 13,250 meters, but in practice the gun crews were warned against using the highest propellant charges. Firing with charges 7 and 8 caused excessive erosion in the chamber, compromising the seal between the cartridge and breech. Use of these charges required authorization from a field commander, could not be fired more than 10 rounds consecutively, and had to be recorded in writing. The practical fighting range, therefore, was much shorter. Often crews limited themselves to charges that allowed firing out to only about 10,000 meters, roughly 6 miles, to preserve the barrel for sustained operations. This was adequate, or so they had been told. 6 to 8 miles of range meant the guns could support attacking infantry from safe positions behind the front lines. It meant they could provide covering fire during advances and defensive fire during withdrawals. It meant they could reach most enemy positions before those enemy positions could reach them. The theory had worked well enough in Poland, where the Polish artillery was even shorter ranged and disorganized. It had worked in France, where the combination of rapid advance and Luftwaffe superiority kept enemy guns off balance. It had even seemed to work in the early months in Russia, when the Wehrmacht was advancing and Soviet artillery was retreating. But then came the Eastern Front in earnest. By 1942, German artillerymen began to encounter something unexpected. Soviet guns were firing at them from ranges the SFH-18 couldn't match. The Russian 122mm A-19 gun could fire out to 20,400 meters, more than 12 miles. The 152mm ML-20 gun howitzer could reach 17,300 meters, nearly 11 miles. German guns were being destroyed by artillery they couldn't even fire back at. The Soviet gunners could sit beyond German range and methodically pound German positions with impunity. The solution had been attempted. Modified versions of the SFH-18 were produced, designated SFH-18M, fitted with muzzle brakes and replaceable barrel liners. These modifications pushed the range to 15,100 meters, a little over 9 miles. But the modifications created new problems. The barrel liners suffered increased wear. The recoil system couldn't handle the increased loads despite the muzzle brake. The guns became less reliable, not more capable. Rocket-assisted projectiles were developed, experimental rounds that incorporated a rocket motor to boost range. In theory, the Rückstoßgranate 19 could extend the howitzer's reach to 18,200 meters, putting it on par with Soviet guns. In practice, the rocket blast disrupted the airflow over the shell body, destroying accuracy. The rocket booster also decreased the space available for explosive payload, reducing the effectiveness of shells that actually landed on target. The rocket rounds were withdrawn from service shortly after being introduced in 1941. The Wehrmacht attempted to compensate by producing heavier guns. The 17-centimeter Kanone 18 could fire out to more than 30,000 meters, nearly 19 miles. But these weapons were enormous, cumbersome, and produced in limited numbers. They could not be deployed at the divisional level. Most German artillery battalions continued to depend on the SFH-18, and the SFH-18 was being consistently outranged. Klaus Hartmann learned this reality not from official reports but from bitter experience. In his 2 years on the Eastern Front, he watched as Soviet artillery systematically destroyed German gun positions. The pattern was always the same. German guns would set up, begin firing, and within minutes Soviet shells would begin landing on them with uncanny accuracy. The German crews would try to move, but the SFH-18 was heavy and slow. The Krupp carriage had been designed for horse teams, not motorized transport. Even when tractors were available, the lack of suspension meant the guns couldn't be moved quickly over rough terrain. They became sitting targets. Many German gunners had been killed this way, Caught in the open by counter-battery fire they had no way to suppress. Hartmann had survived only because he had been on a supply run when Soviet shells obliterated his gun and killed his 5 crewmates. The memory of returning to find nothing but cratered earth and scattered equipment haunted him still. German artillery superiority was a lie. German guns could not match their enemies. The Wehrmacht was fighting a losing artillery war, and every gunner who survived long enough to understand the mathematics knew it. After his gun crew was killed, Hartmann had been transferred to an infantry unit, part of the constant shuffling of personnel that characterized the German army by 1943. Casualties were too high, replacements too few. Men went where they were needed, regardless of training or preference. He carried with him the knowledge he had gained as an artilleryman, the ability to recognize the sound of different calibers, to estimate range and bearing from the sound of incoming fire. It was a skill he had never wanted but could not forget. By December of 1944, Klaus Hartmann found himself assigned to the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, part of Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army, the spearhead force for Operation Wacht am Rhein. Hitler's plan was ambitious: strike through the thinly defended Ardennes forest, reach the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, split the Allied armies and force them to negotiate. The officers assured the men that surprise and winter weather would neutralize Allied air superiority. German armor would once again demonstrate its dominance. Victory was possible. The attack began on the morning of December 16th with a massive artillery barrage. 1,600 German guns opened fire along a 130-kilometer front, 30 minutes of sustained bombardment designed to shatter American positions and clear the way for the armor. For Hartmann, participating in the infantry assault, it seemed like the old days. German guns speaking with one voice, the earth trembling under the weight of German firepower. Perhaps the propaganda had been right. Perhaps German artillery was still supreme. The initial advance seemed to confirm this hope. American units were caught by surprise, disorganized, falling back in confusion. German troops overran positions and captured equipment. Roads were seized, villages fell. For the first 2 days, it seemed possible that the offensive might succeed. The weather remained poor, keeping Allied aircraft grounded. German armor pushed forward, and the infantry followed, moving through the snowy forests of the Ardennes with grim determination. But there were delays. Traffic jams clogged the narrow roads. Fuel shortages slowed the advance. American resistance, though initially scattered, began to solidify. And then there was the artillery. By the 3rd day of the offensive, December 18th, the German advance in the northern sector had run into an immovable obstacle. The Americans had pulled back to a piece of high ground east of the Belgian town of Elsenborn, a boomerang-shaped ridge rising more than 2,000 feet above sea level. The ridge commanded the roads and villages below. Taking it was essential if the 6th Panzer Army was to reach its objectives. Without control of the Elsenborn Ridge, the northern thrust would fail. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division was committed to the attack alongside the battered remains of the 12th SS Panzer Division. The assault began on December 20th. Hartmann and his comrades advanced through the snow-covered fields toward the American positions. For the first few minutes, it seemed achievable. The American lines appeared thin. The Germans had tanks and experience and momentum. Then the American artillery opened fire. Klaus Hartmann had heard artillery barrages before. He had survived Soviet bombardments that went on for hours. He had called in German fire missions and watched the shells land. He thought he understood artillery. But what happened at Elsenborn Ridge defied everything he knew. The American shells came in waves, precise and unrelenting. They weren't random. They weren't scattered. Every concentration of German troops drew immediate fire. Every attempt to mass for an assault was met with devastating barrages that broke up formations before they could attack. The shells landed with an accuracy that seemed impossible, and they kept coming, hour after hour, without pause, without mercy, without any sign of diminishing. Hartmann tried to estimate the caliber from the sound and impact. These were heavy guns, he knew that immediately. But they were firing from positions that made no sense. German counter-battery fire was ordered, and Hartmann watched as the SFH-18 howitzers of the supporting artillery battalion set up and began firing toward the American gun positions. The German shells fell short by kilometers. The American guns, wherever they were, remained untouched, and they kept firing. On December 21st, the Germans tried again. Officers reorganized the shattered units. New orders came down. The ridge had to be taken. The offensive depended on it. The troops prepared for another assault, knowing what was coming, unable to stop it, trapped by orders that made no military sense but carried the weight of Hitler's will behind them. The American barrage began before the Germans could even form up. Shells rained down on assembly areas. Men died before the attack started. Those who survived tried to advance through the fire, but it was hopeless. The artillery was too heavy, too accurate, too unceasing. German soldiers went to ground, seeking any cover, any protection from the steel that fell from the sky. Hartmann pressed himself into a shallow depression in the frozen earth, his rifle clutched uselessly to his chest. Above him the air screamed with passing shells. Around him the ground erupted in fountains of dirt and snow and shrapnel. Men screamed, equipment burned. And still the shells kept coming, landing with mechanical precision, methodical and relentless. He began counting. Not the explosions, there were too many, but the timing between salvos. 10 seconds, 12 seconds, 15, then another wave. The Americans were firing time on target missions, he realized. Multiple batteries firing simultaneously, so all shells arrived at the same moment. It was a technique that required sophisticated fire direction, precise coordination, and excellent communications. The Wehrmacht had studied this method but rarely managed to execute it effectively in the field. The Americans were doing it continuously. Between bombardments, Hartmann risked lifting his head to look around. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The attack had failed before it began. Dead and wounded, Germans lay scattered across the snow. Equipment was destroyed. Officers were dead or pinned down like everyone else. There would be no advance. There was only survival. As darkness fell on December 21st, the remnants of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division pulled back from the killing ground before Elsenborn Ridge. Hartmann stumbled through the snow with the other survivors, past abandoned equipment and scattered bodies, back toward German lines that seemed impossibly far away. The American artillery continued firing, harassing fire now, searching for moving targets in the darkness. Men died during the retreat, as well as during the attack. When the survivors finally reached positions far enough behind the lines to be safe from American artillery, they collapsed in exhaustion. Klaus Hartmann found himself in a ruined barn with perhaps 20 other men from his company. No one spoke. They were too tired, too cold, too haunted by what they had just experienced. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing. Inside, men huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the darkness. An hour later, an Oberleutnant arrived, a young artillery officer who had been coordinating fire support for the attack. He looked as exhausted as the infantryman, his face grey with fatigue and something else. Defeat. He carried a map case and a field telephone, the tools of his profession, now seemingly useless. "We cannot advance," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "The American artillery makes it impossible." One of the Unteroffiziers, a veteran with a scarred face, spat into the straw, "Then bring up our own guns. Silence theirs." The Oberleutnant shook his head. "We tried. For 3 days we have tried. Our guns cannot reach them." The words hung in the cold air. Cannot reach them. For men raised on propaganda about German technical superiority, the statement was almost incomprehensible. German guns were supposed to be the best in the world. German artillery was supposed to dominate the battlefield. How could the Americans have guns that German artillery could not reach? How far? Hartmann heard himself ask. How far can they shoot? The Oberleutnant looked at him with hollow eyes. We believe they have 155mm guns. The Americans call them long toms. Our intelligence estimates they can fire to more than 20,000 meters, perhaps as far as 23,000. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. Our SFH-18 fires to 13,000 meters in practice, maybe 15,000 if we push the charges and risk the barrels. The Americans outrange us by 7 to 10 kilometers. They can destroy us and we cannot fire back. 7 to 10 kilometers, 4 to 6 miles. The Americans could sit beyond the range of German guns and methodically destroy German positions with absolute impunity. The tactical implications were staggering. Artillery was supposed to duel with artillery. Whoever had longer range had an advantage, yes, but not an insurmountable one. Guns could be moved, positions could be shifted. But a 7-mile advantage? That wasn't an advantage. That was domination. Hartmann thought back to his training, to everything he had been told about German artillery superiority. The SFH-18 was supposed to be one of the finest howitzers in the world. It had been designed by Krupp and Rheinmetall, Germany's premier arms manufacturers. It had been refined through years of development. Production had reached thousands of units, and it was obsolete, not because of poor design, not because of manufacturing defects, but because the Americans had simply built better guns. The Oberleutnant continued, his voice flat with exhaustion and despair. They have more than 300 guns positioned around Elsenborn Ridge. 155mm, 105mm, 75mm, heavy mortars, all of them coordinated, all of them connected by radio and telephone. They can bring the fire of every gun to bear on any target within minutes. Our forward observers report that when they call for fire, the American shells arrive before our own can respond. 300 guns. The number was almost impossible to comprehend. The entire German artillery park supporting the 6th Panzer Army offensive numbered perhaps 1,600 guns, spread across a 130-kilometer front. The Americans had concentrated 300 pieces on a single ridge, wheel to wheel, creating a density of firepower that no German force could hope to match. And the ammunition, another soldier muttered. They never run out. This was true. Even when German guns managed to fire, they were limited by ammunition supply. By late 1944, German logistics were collapsing. Railroads were bombed. Trucks lacked fuel. Ammunition production was hampered by labor shortages, with factory workers being drafted into the military and replaced by prisoners of war and slave laborers who had no incentive to maintain quality. Many shells failed to explode. Many others exploded prematurely. The ammunition that did work had to be carefully rationed. The Americans had no such constraints. Their artillery fired constantly, lavishly, with an abundance that seemed impossible, tens of thousands of rounds per day. On December 22nd alone, the 1st Infantry Division Artillery had fired 10,000 rounds in support of defensive positions at Dom-Butgenbach, just south of Elsenborn Ridge. 10,000 rounds in one day from one division's artillery. The weight of metal falling on German positions was beyond anything in German experience, including the Eastern Front. Where did all this ammunition come from? Hartmann wondered. American industrial capacity was a subject of rumor and speculation among German soldiers. The propaganda claimed that American production was bloated and inefficient, that their weapons were crude, mass-produced garbage that would fail in real combat. But the evidence before Hartmann's eyes told a different story. The Americans had ships and trucks and railroads that worked. They had factories that produced shells faster than their guns could fire them. They had a system that delivered ammunition to the front lines with mechanical efficiency. Germany, by contrast, was being strangled. The Luftwaffe was gone from the skies. The railroads were bombed day and night. Fuel was so scarce that horses were being used to move artillery pieces designed for motor transport. The gap between propaganda and reality had become too wide to ignore. Over the next 2 days, the pattern repeated. German forces attempted to attack the Elsenborn Ridge. American artillery destroyed them. German guns tried to provide counter-battery fire. American guns remained out of range and untouched. German officers continued to order attacks because Hitler's plan required taking the ridge, but the men doing the attacking knew the truth. They were being sent into a killing zone with no hope of success. Klaus Hartmann survived because he was cautious, because he was experienced, because he was lucky. Many of his comrades did not. The 3rd Panzergrenadier Division, which had begun the offensive as a functioning military unit, ceased to exist as an effective force by December 23rd. The 12th SS Panzer Division, once one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, was shattered. The entire northern thrust of the Ardennes offensive had been stopped cold by American infantry and American artillery on a ridge in Belgium that most Germans had never heard of. On December 24th, German prisoners began being captured in significant numbers. American forces, no longer purely defensive, started conducting local counterattacks. German units, exhausted and depleted, were surrounded and forced to surrender. Hartmann was captured on Christmas Day during a failed German attempt to withdraw from an exposed position. He and 43 other men were marched to the rear through snow and mud, past American artillery positions that were still firing. As a prisoner, Hartmann saw things he had not been able to see during the battle. He saw the American supply network, with endless convoys of trucks bringing ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment to the front lines. He saw American soldiers who seemed well-fed, well-equipped, and confident. He saw the guns. The American guards led the prisoners past an artillery position where several long toms were set up, firing toward German positions. Hartmann stopped, staring at the weapons despite the guards' orders to keep moving. These were the guns that had destroyed his division. He had to see them. The long tom was massive. It sat on an 8-wheeled carriage with a 2-wheel limber that allowed the trail ends to be moved. The barrel alone appeared to be at least 20 feet long, perhaps longer. The whole assembly looked far more modern than the German SFH-18, with better suspension, better mobility, better everything. American crews worked around the gun with practiced efficiency, loading, firing, adjusting, firing again. The rhythm was constant and mechanical. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. One of the American artillerymen noticed Hartmann staring and walked over, curious. He was young, probably no older than 20, with a friendly face that seemed incongruous with the massive weapon he served. "First time seeing a long tom?" the American asked in broken German. Hartmann nodded, unable to speak. The American grinned. "Hell of a gun, isn't it? We can drop a shell on your guys from 14 miles away. You can't even see us when we shoot." 14 miles, 23 kilometers. The numbers were accurate then. The American artillery could reach any German position on the battlefield while remaining completely safe from German counterfire. It was not a fair fight. It had never been a fair fight. "How many rounds?" Hartmann managed to ask. "Today?" The American shrugged. "We've fired about 600 rounds from this gun alone since dawn. We've got plenty more. They bring it up by the truckload. 600 rounds from one gun in one day." Hartmann tried to imagine German artillery firing 600 rounds in a day and couldn't. German guns might fire 600 rounds in a week if ammunition was available. The scale of American firepower was beyond anything in German doctrine or experience. "Your guns?" the American continued, conversationally. "They any good?" Hartmann thought about the SFH-18, about its limited range, its mobility problems, its ammunition shortages, its inadequacy in every measurable way against the weapon before him. "They were good enough?" he said quietly. "Once." The American seemed to understand. "Yeah, war's changed, I guess. You guys had the best stuff in 39, 38, but we caught up." He gestured at the long tom. "And then we kept going." An American sergeant yelled something, and the young artilleryman jogged back to his gun. The column of prisoners was ordered to move on. Hartman walked in silence, processing what he had seen. The Americans had better guns, better logistics, better ammunition supply, better everything. And they knew it. There was no arrogance in the young artilleryman's voice, just matter-of-fact confidence. American artillery was superior, and everyone on the battlefield understood it. The prisoner of war camp was in Belgium, behind American lines, but far enough from the front to be safe from German counterattack. Hundreds of German prisoners were being processed there, sorted by rank and unit, interrogated, catalogued. Hartman found himself in a large tent with 50 other men, most of them from various units involved in the Ardennes offensive. The mood was subdued. These were not men who expected to return to combat. These were men who understood the war was lost. On the evening of December 26th, an American intelligence officer arrived to conduct interrogations. He was a captain, older than most of the American soldiers Hartman had seen, with wire-rimmed glasses and a thoughtful expression. He spoke excellent German. His questions were not about troop movements or defensive positions. Those tactical details were already obsolete. Instead, he asked about morale, about supplies, about what German soldiers thought of American capabilities. When it was Hartman's turn, the captain reviewed his service record. Artillery crew, Eastern Front veteran, transferred to infantry. Captured at Elsenborn. You were an artilleryman, the captain said. Tell me about your guns. Hartman described the SFH-18 honestly. There seemed little point in deception. The specifications were not secret. The limitations were not classified. They were simply facts. Maximum effective range? The captain asked. 13 kilometers, Hartman replied. Perhaps 15 with the special charges, but those wear out the barrel. The captain made a note. And you saw our long toms? Yes. What did you think? Hartman paused, considering his answer. The truth seemed both obvious and impossible. I thought that we were told Germany had the best artillery in the world. I thought the propaganda was true. But your guns can reach twice as far as ours. You have more ammunition than we can imagine. Your fire direction is faster and more accurate. You destroyed our attack with artillery alone. Our guns could not silence yours because we could not reach you. He met the captain's eyes. I thought that everything we were told was a lie. The captain wrote for a long moment, then looked up. Many German prisoners say the same thing, about the artillery especially. One man told me he thought your guns were automatic because they fired so fast and never seemed thutties. To stop. Hartman had heard similar speculation. Some German soldiers, unable to comprehend the volume of American artillery fire, had convinced themselves that the Americans must have developed some kind of automatic gun, a machine that loaded and fired without human intervention. The reality was both simpler and more devastating. The Americans just had more guns, more ammunition, better training, and better coordination. They didn't need magical technology. They had industrial capacity. Why did we lose? Hartman asked, surprising himself. It was an improper question, one that could be interpreted as defeatism, but he was beyond caring about such things now. The captain considered the question seriously. You didn't lose because of one thing, but artillery mattered. You Germans are very good soldiers, excellent tactically, but you couldn't overcome the material disadvantage. We can afford to fire 10 shells for every one you fire. We can replace destroyed guns overnight. You can't. And as the war went on, that gap got wider. He paused. Your officers knew this. Your leadership knew the production numbers. They knew America was producing more steel, more shells, more everything. But they couldn't admit it publicly because that would mean admitting the war was lost. This made a terrible kind of sense. The propaganda had to continue because the alternative was admitting defeat. The officers had to order attacks because showing weakness meant execution. The soldiers had to advance because refusing meant the firing squad. Everyone was trapped in a system that required believing lies, even as reality destroyed those lies shell by shell. Over the following days, Hartmann talked with other German prisoners who had faced American artillery. Their stories were all similar: overwhelming firepower, constant bombardment, inability to respond, casualties that made continued resistance impossible. Some of the prisoners had been captured on the Eastern Front and transferred west before the Ardennes offensive. They said the American artillery was worse than the Soviet artillery, not because individual guns were more powerful, but because the Americans used their artillery with ruthless efficiency and limitless ammunition. One man, an Obergefreiter from the 777th Volksgrenadier Division, described attacking the American positions near Monschau on December 18th. "We advanced through the snow," he said. "We thought we had surprise. Then their artillery opened fire. It was like nothing I had ever experienced. The shells fell everywhere, on our assembly areas, on our routes of advance, on our fallback positions. They knew where we were before we moved, and the shells never stopped coming. We took 60% casualties before we even made contact with their infantry. We couldn't advance. We couldn't retreat. We just died." Another prisoner, a lieutenant from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, had a similar story. "Our orders were to take Loshheimer Graben and advance to Büllingen. We attacked on the first day of the offensive. The American infantry fell back, and we thought we were winning. Then we tried to move through the village, and their artillery destroyed us. They had registered every street, every building, every crossroads. When we took cover in houses, they brought the houses down on top of us. When we tried to advance in the open, they hit us with airburst shells. We lost 200 men in 2 hours. The Americans didn't need to fight us with infantry. They just used artillery." The pattern was clear. American artillery had stopped the entire northern thrust of the Ardennes offensive. Not American tanks, though those were present. Not American infantry, though they fought bravely. Artillery. The Americans had positioned over 300 guns on and around Elsenborn Ridge, creating the largest concentration of artillery firepower in American military history to that point. German forces had literally run into a wall of steel. The defensive success at Elsenborn had broader consequences. The 6th Panzer Army, unable to advance past the ridge, could not access the northern roads it needed to reach the Meuse. The offensive timetable collapsed. German units became stranded without fuel. The famous Kampfgruppe Piper, which had broken through American lines and advanced deep into Belgium, found itself cut off and surrounded because the main German thrust had been stopped at Elsenborn. Without support, Piper was forced to abandon his tanks and retreat on foot, leaving behind nearly all his equipment. By January of 1945, the Ardennes offensive had completely failed. The Americans and British had regrouped, counterattacked, and driven the Germans back to their starting positions. The Wehrmacht had suffered nearly 100,000 casualties, lost hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles, and consumed the last strategic reserves Hitler had been hoarding. The 6th Panzer Army was transferred to the Eastern Front, where it would be ground to pieces, trying to stop the Soviet advance into Hungary. The war in the West was effectively over. Klaus Hartmann spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. He was eventually transferred to a camp in France, then later to England, where German prisoners worked on farms and in factories under relatively humane conditions. He was well fed, adequately housed, and not mistreated. This, too, contradicted everything the propaganda had said about how the Western Allies treated prisoners. After the war ended in May of 1945, Hartmann remained in captivity for another year before being repatriated to Germany. He returned to a country that no longer existed, divided between occupation zones, its cities in ruins, its people starving. The Third Reich had promised 1,000 years of German dominance. It had lasted 12 years and left Germany destroyed. In the decades after the war, Klaus Hartmann rarely spoke about his experiences. Like many German veterans, he found it difficult to reconcile what he had believed with what had actually happened. The propaganda had been so persuasive, so comprehensive, so carefully constructed, and it had been completely wrong. But when historians began studying the Battle of the Bulge in detail, Hartmann agreed to be interviewed. He wanted to explain something that he thought was poorly understood. The German defeat was not simply a matter of being outnumbered. The Germans had been outnumbered before and won. The defeat was not simply a matter of losing air superiority, though that mattered. The defeat was fundamentally about industrial capacity and the material realities that industrial capacity created. We were told that German engineering was superior. Hartmann said in one interview conducted in 1973, "We believed it because the evidence seemed to support it. Our tanks were better designed. Our aircraft were more advanced in some ways. Our soldiers were well trained, but none of that mattered when the Americans could build 10 artillery pieces for every one we built and supply them with unlimited ammunition. Quality cannot overcome that kind of quantity gap. We learned this lesson slowly, at terrible cost." The numbers supported his assessment. By late 1944, American factories were producing more than 40,000 artillery pieces per year, along with hundreds of millions of rounds of ammunition. German production had collapsed under Allied bombing, raw material shortages, and labor problems. German guns were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. German ammunition was so scarce that artillery units had to severely ration their fire. The Long Tom, officially designated the 155mm gun M1, had been developed in the 1930s as part of American artillery modernization. It fired a 100-pound shell to a maximum range of 23,000 meters, 14 miles, with supercharged propellant. The gun was accurate, reliable, and produced in large numbers. Approximately 1,000 Long Toms were manufactured during the war, equipping dozens of artillery battalions. They saw service in North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, and the Pacific. They remained in service long after the war, participating in the Korean War in the 1950s. The German SFH-18, by contrast, was obsolete by 1944, despite having been considered adequate when introduced in 1935. Its range was too short. Its mobility was too limited. Its design, originally intended for horse teams, could not be easily adapted to mechanized warfare. Over 5,000 SFH-18 howitzers were produced during the war, but they were increasingly inadequate against Allied artillery that consistently outranged them. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated this disparity with brutal clarity. American artillery, positioned on the high ground and firing from beyond the range of German counter-battery fire, had destroyed multiple German divisions without those divisions ever coming close to American gun positions. The Americans had used their technical and material advantages with ruthless efficiency. German troops, no matter how brave or well-trained, could not overcome the fact that American guns could reach them and German guns could not reach back. Military historians later identified the defense of Elsenborn Ridge as one of the most decisive actions of the Battle of the Bulge. Historian John S.D. Eisenhower noted that the action of the 2nd and 99th Divisions on the northern shoulder could be considered the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. The ridge was the only sector of the American front, a line where the Germans failed to advance at all during the offensive. By holding that ridge, American forces denied the Germans access to 2 of the 5 planned routes of advance and severely constrained German operations throughout the northern sector. The artillery had been the key to this success. The American ability to mass fire from hundreds of guns, to coordinate that fire through sophisticated communications, and to sustain that fire with abundant ammunition had created a defensive perimeter that no German force could penetrate. The German army, which had conquered most of Europe with aggressive maneuver warfare, had been stopped by the oldest principle of warfare. Whoever controls the high ground and has longer-ranged weapons controls the battlefield. For Klaus Hartmann, this realization had come too late to matter. By the time he understood that German artillery was inadequate, he was already a prisoner, and Germany was already defeated. But the lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life. Propaganda could not overcome physics. Belief could not extend the range of a howitzer. National pride could not manufacture ammunition that didn't exist. In his final interview before his death in 1987, Hartman was asked what he would want people to understand about his experience. His answer was simple and direct. "Understand that we were told lies," he said. "We believed those lies because we wanted to believe them, because our entire society reinforced them, because questioning them was dangerous. We were told German weapons were superior. We were told German soldiers were invincible. We were told that quantity could never overcome quality." All of these statements were false, but we didn't realize it until we were facing American artillery that could kill us from distances our own guns could not reach. By then, it was too late. The war was lost. Germany was destroyed. Millions were dead. And for what? For lies we believed because we were afraid to see the truth. The technical specifications told the story in cold numbers. The American 155mm long tom, maximum range, 23,000 meters. The German 15cm SFH-18, maximum practical range, 13,000 meters. A difference of 10,000 meters, roughly 6 miles, roughly 10 kilometers. That gap represented the distance between German propaganda and reality. That gap represented the space where German soldiers died under American shells they could not answer. That gap represented the industrial and technical superiority that decided the war. American military analysts after the war studied German equipment extensively. They found that German weapons were often well designed, sometimes innovative, occasionally superior to Allied equivalents in specific characteristics. But German weapons were also over-engineered, difficult to produce, and impossible to manufacture in the quantities required for modern industrial warfare. The Germans had created weapons for a short war that would be decided by tactical brilliance. The Allies had created weapons for a long war that would be decided by industrial output. The SFH-18 was not a bad gun by the standards of 1935. It was simply obsolete by 1944. German attempts to modify it, to extend its range, to compensate for its limitations, all failed because the basic design could not be substantially improved without starting over completely. And Germany did not have the time, resources, or industrial capacity to start over. They had to fight with what they had, and what they had was not enough. Captured German soldiers often commented on American artillery with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. One report from American intelligence officers noted that German prisoners frequently remarked on the accuracy and swiftness of target acquisition of American artillery, and especially the prodigious amount of artillery ammunition expended. Many German soldiers reported that artillery, not aircraft or tanks or infantry, was what they feared most about facing American forces. The constant bombardment, the psychological pressure of being under fire from weapons they could not suppress, broke German units more effectively than any other Allied capability. The defense of Elsenborn Ridge became a textbook example of how to use artillery defensively. American artillery officers studied the battle extensively, analyzing how over 300 guns had been coordinated to create a defensive barrier that no German force could cross. The techniques developed at Elsenborn, particularly the use of time on target fire missions that brought shells from multiple batteries to impact simultaneously, became standard American artillery doctrine. For the Germans, Elsenborn represented something different, the final collapse of the myths that had sustained them, the myth of German technical superiority, the myth of German military invincibility, the myth that willpower and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantages. All of these myths had been progressively destroyed during the war, but Elsenborn made the destruction undeniable. German soldiers faced American artillery that outranged them, outfired them, and destroyed them. There was no tactical solution. There was no doctrinal answer. There was only the brutal reality of being on the receiving end of firepower they could not match. Klaus Hartmann's story was not unique. Thousands of German soldiers had similar experiences. They had been raised in a system that told them Germany was superior. They had been trained to believe that German weapons were the best. They had been assured that German military prowess would guarantee victory. And then they encountered the industrial might of the United States and realized that everything they had been told was wrong. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. For soldiers raised on propaganda, trained to believe in national superiority, indoctrinated to think that will and spirit could overcome material disadvantages, the encounter with overwhelming Allied firepower was devastating. It meant that their sacrifices had been based on lies. It meant that the war had been unwinnable from the start. It meant that all the death and suffering had been for nothing. Many German veterans struggled with this knowledge after the war. Some retreated into denial, insisting that Germany could have won if only certain decisions had been different. Others embraced the truth and had to live with the weight of it. Klaus Hartmann was among the latter. He knew what he had experienced. He knew the Americans had better artillery, better logistics, better industrial capacity. He knew that German propaganda had been false, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand how an entire nation could believe lies so completely that millions died for them. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge stands as a testament to the importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. It demonstrated that quality alone cannot overcome significant quantitative disadvantages. It proved that logistics and supply are as important as tactics and training. It showed that artillery, properly employed with sufficient ammunition, remains one of the most decisive weapons on the battlefield. For the Americans defending the ridge, the battle was a desperate fight against long odds. They had been caught by surprise, pushed back, forced to retreat to defensive positions. But they had held. The infantry had held, the artillery had held, and the combination of determined defense and overwhelming firepower had stopped the German offensive cold. For the Germans attacking the ridge, the battle was the moment when reality finally overwhelmed propaganda. They had advanced, expecting to break through, expecting their training and experience to prevail, expecting that German military superiority would tell. Instead, they had run into artillery fire so intense, so accurate, and so sustained that advancement became impossible. They had tried to suppress that artillery with their own guns and discovered they could not reach the American positions. They had realized, too late, that they were fighting a war they could not win. The irony is bitter. Germany had started World War II with artillery doctrine emphasizing aggressive offensive use of fire. German artillery in 1939 and 1940 had supported the rapid advances that conquered Poland and France. German gunners had been skilled, well-trained, and effective. But Germany had never developed the industrial capacity to sustain that effectiveness once the war turned into a grinding struggle of attrition. By 1944, German artillery was rationing ammunition, while American artillery fired without restraint. At Elsenborn Ridge, this disparity reached its logical conclusion. American guns fired tens of thousands of rounds per day. German guns fired hundreds. American shells kept coming, endless convoys bringing ammunition from factories across the Atlantic. German shells grew scarce, with supply lines cut by air attack and factories destroyed by bombing. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The side that could fire more shells would win. And America could fire vastly more shells. Klaus Hartmann understood this, finally, as a prisoner of war watching American trucks deliver ammunition in quantities he had never imagined possible. He understood it more deeply after the war, when he learned the production statistics and realized just how completely Germany had been outmatched industrially. But he understood it first and most viscerally on the snow-covered killing ground before Elsenborn Ridge, when American shells fell from beyond the range of German guns, and there was nothing he could do except press himself into the frozen earth and pray to survive. This is the story that propaganda tried to hide. This is the reality that nationalistic myths could not acknowledge. This is the truth that Klaus Hartmann and thousands of German soldiers learned in the winter of 1944, that industrial capacity matters more than ideology, that material advantage trumps fighting spirit, and that the side with longer-ranged guns controls the battlefield, no matter how brave or skilled its enemies might be. The Americans did not win at Elsenborn Ridge because they were better soldiers than the Germans. They won because they had better artillery, more ammunition, superior logistics, and the industrial capacity to sustain their firepower indefinitely. They won because they could fire 10 shells for every one the Germans fired. They won because their long-tom guns could reach German positions while German SFH-18 howitzers could not fire back. This was the lesson of Elsenborn Ridge, written in steel and blood across the frozen hills of Belgium. And it was a lesson that Klaus Hartmann, veteran German artilleryman, carried with him for the rest of his life. Thank you for watching. For more detailed and historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.